Happy Tuesday. So we are a little later getting started than we had planned. But we're going to start by seeing some language that Beth put together on just the pre-K portion of the bill, S56, and then we're going to get our walkthrough on S100. As we sort of talked about before, we have fairly limited jurisdiction over the bill, and so in an ideal universe, we would be ready to vote for it after the floor today. There are various predictions on what's going to happen on the floor today in terms of timing. So we might be coming back after the floor, we might not, but we definitely are not going to make it to S56 with Commissioner Bolio, so we'll do that another day this week. And with that, Beth, can you show us all the things you do?
Yes, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm going to share my screen. Is that large enough?
Works for me.
Okay. So I think I'm gonna, my testimony is just gonna be around the pre-kindergarten sections. I think we can skip legislative intent. I don't think you all made any changes to that for pre-K purposes. So I think we can go right into the section 2, which is the pre-kindergarten education implementation committee plan. And this is actually, is this your first time seeing the strike all?
Yes.
Okay.
The reason it's there.
Let's orient us. So this, do you want to do it or do you want me to?
So last time we looked at sections, we were looking at it as sort of like section by section amendments, so that we could like have discussions about those sections and make decisions about them without getting confused by the whole bill. But now we're going to start looking at the strike all because we had sort of talked through all those sections and what we're going to vote out as a strike all so that a bill this complex doesn't need more confusion added to it, in my humble opinion. And so strike all is a way to sort of lessen confusion because not everyone actually knows what they're reading.
Excellent. Great. So this is the language that we're going to see, and I'm going to scroll through a lot of it, is the entire, all of the language related to pre-kindergarten in S56. I've done my best to highlight just the changes you all have made since the last time we talked about some of this language. So we're going to start with section 2, the pre-K implementation committee plan. The first change occurs to the membership. So subsection B is the membership. You'll see there's no highlighting, there's no highlighting, there's no highlighting. We get to page 4 and there's some highlighting. So everything above line 5, as far as membership goes, was included in the last drafts that you all saw, came out of House Education, that amended House Ways and Means membership. And so this language is new for you all. So it adds back in the Head Start Collaboration Office Director or designee. That was a part of the House Ways and Means recommendation. The 2 family representatives are added back in. Again, this language is in the Ways and Means, the Human Services report. New for anything on the House side and the Senate side would be the Executive Director of the Vermont Association for the Education of Young Children or designee, and a member of the School Construction Task Force appointed by the Secretary of Education. Move on.
Okay. So this was sort of like, there was the House, there was the Human Services, then there was Human Services work, there was House Education work, which was sort of a everyone wins version. And the School Construction Aid Task Force, we've talked with Julia a lot about how the facilities are going to be an important part of that. So I wanted to make sure someone with expertise on that.
The next change is to subsection C. These are the powers and duties of the implementation committee. And this change is small, but it's still a change. By the time the language got to you, there was just language about transitioning, or there was no transitioning language. There was just language that talked about yielding distinct recommendations for different pre-kindergarten ages. And so the language now reads that the charge of the committee is to examine and make recommendations on the changes necessary to provide pre-kindergarten education to all children by or through the public school system on or before July 1, 2026, including transitioning students from the 10-hour pre-K benefit, which may yield distinct recommendations for different ages. And then there are some additions to the committee's charges here. So previously 1 and 2 were just kind of lumped together in one sentence, but we've added quite a bit, so now we have a list. So the minimum number of hours that shall constitute a full school day and the geographic considerations, I believe, was language that came to you all.
Number 1 there. By having the word both in there, are we implying that that full school day should be the same for pre-kindergarten education and kindergarten? Just took both out, does that indicate that they could be different? Or maybe I'm reading too much into it.
I see what you're saying. We could certainly take out the word both.
And we'd still get recommendations on what a full school day would mean for those 2 categories.
You ask for the two grades.
But not implying that they have to necessarily be the same.
Would you like me to make that change?
That's fine.
So I think there could be confusion on whether this is meant to signify whether the minimum number of hours recommended should be the same for both pre-K and kindergarten, or whether the charge is just come back with the minimum number of hours for kindergarten, period, or comma, pre-kindergarten. And so I don't think it hurts to remove the word both at all. Would you like me to do that?
I would, and I would include the comma after the word education.
Pre-kindergarten education.
So it separates.
Commas and ands is the duty of the editors, and we do not interfere in Oxford comma debates within.
Thank you.
That is beyond our scope here in the opinion committee.
We're going to jump to 3. We're going to leave the Oxford comma on the table. So this is all language coming out of your committee. So number 3, line 13, recommendations for pre-kindergarten education tuition rates based on the allowable tuition rates for elementary students under 16 VSA 823. That is the section in Title 16 that addresses tuition and how tuition is calculated and the allowable amounts for grades K through for elementary school for the town tuition program. So this would say, come back to us with tuition rates, but under the framework of this section.
Comparatively speaking, basically.
Yes. Do you want me to talk about what those are or just keep going?
Make sure I understood the language, and I think it's fine. Thank you.
The committee also needs to come back with recommendations for the administrative process governing contracting for pre-K education, including recommendations for the pre-kindergarten education tuition process. There was conversation last time about how the money flows, and so this language is meant to get at that concept. 5, recommendations for the facilities needs of school districts for the provision of pre-kindergarten education. 6, recommendations for the standards governing which individuals may obtain an educator license or endorsement for teaching pre-kindergarten education, including provisional licensing requirements for pre-kindergarten educators.
So one of the sort of questions or concerns that I have around this piece is the kind of supervision piece that I understand has been sometimes challenging for childcare centers, sort of operating within an SU. Does this language sufficiently sort of address that piece, or does it just determine, oh, if you meet these things, you're eligible for provisional license, but sort of who holds the risk and liability for that license?
So this is meant to ask, the language here is meant to ask the committee to come back for, I don't know how to say this. I took this language right out of the statute. The standards governing which individuals may obtain is language that appears in the educator licensing statute. So this is meant to say, come back to us with what you think is necessary for a pre-K teacher to be licensed. Whether that's through licensure, the base level licensure, and then and any endorsement pieces, as well as the provisional licensing requirement, which I think is different than the full licensure requirement. So really being kind of broad in what asking, come back with everything involving licensing and pre-K teachers.
And is the sort of the nitty-gritty details of it something that happens in rulemaking?
Yes, so the, I always get this wrong because there's a similar body for lawyers. I'm not going to get it right here. Let me look this up really quickly. It is called Standards Board for Professional Educators, and they do all the rulemaking related to those standards.
So I guess maybe I would like to build on this. I think this is important to be sure that we're being clear about what the requirements for all the different licensing are. I think would like the committee also to sort of investigate whether the who holds the license and whether it's a SU or an AOE and the sort of committee to make some recommendations of how to make sure that centers who have UPK licensed teachers are able to find someone to hold that provisional license for them, and whether that's clarifying whether that's an SU responsibility or an AOE responsibility to make sure that.
So this is not at all my area of expertise. I've actually done very little work in teacher licensing thus far. But I believe this language is broad enough, and you are certainly welcome. You have someone in the room who is far more experienced in this area than me. I believe this language is broad enough in saying, come back to us. You've studied this. You're making a recommendation to us on how pre-K should be provided. Now make recommendations for the licensing requirements to go along with those recommendations. I don't know that you want to be more specific in case the plan that comes back is different than what you are concerned about. But if there are other suggestions from folks who have more experience in this area than me, that might be more helpful to you. But I think this language is broad enough that says come back and recommend something that works for the delivery of pre-kindergarten education in this state.
Yeah, I mean, I did that like a mixed model.
Let's see.
Somebody said, make sure that this works both within our school context and in nonprofit or childcare center contexts as well.
But that's implicit in all that we're talking about throughout the whole rest of the.
Okay.
I think Catherine raises a really important point, and what it is we want to end up with is teachers who are experienced and qualified in all areas. And somewhere along the way, I heard that there are a lot of teachers right now in training for early ed, but they're not out of school yet. They're still in training. So should we assume that that's going to be the case for a while? Is that why we're including this wording? I don't know where this wording came from. But
I think do you want to speak to that, or do you want?
So we're sort of edging into what is definitely the Human Services Committee's jurisdiction. And the reason I felt like it was okay for us to edge into it was because this is part of sort of general recommendations for the cost, related to the cost of pre-K. And sort of the differences between the cost of pre-K, the possible differences between the cost of pre-K and the cost of early ed that we want to get our heads around. But if we get too far into sort of like the supply side of the workforce issue, I think we're edging into human services territory, and they've taken so much testimony on solving that problem, and we haven't taken any on solving that problem. So I want us to stay sort of focused on what we would need to know in order to be able to make sure that we are adequately financing pre-K or equitably financing.
and I'm okay with that.
Yes.
Somebody else will answer that
Yes.
question. So what is it we need to know?
From this study,
Yep.
we need to understand how basically the pre-K system as we want it to be, not as it is, could be weighted, or how those weights might relate to the cost of care in the early ed system, which is a totally separate system.
Okay,
And so licensing is sort of the cost of licensing, and what licensing might look like as part of that.
yeah.
And the Vermont State colleges are educating more and more educators, training up preschoolers as well as what they've been doing traditionally in school, stuff like that. And I see that wording as providing or fostering communication between those that need and those that provide. So that licensing requirements become aligned with each other, hopefully, rather than being off in different directions. Makes sense?
Yeah, I actually haven't been, had an up-to-date license for quite a number of years now,
Yeah.
but at one point I had a teaching license and a principal's license.
Yeah.
The teaching license went from kindergarten through grade 8. And then my principals covered K through 12. But the teaching license didn't cover preschool.
Right. It's a wide open field for many people these days, even though.
Is there licensing for preschool now? There is. Okay,
So my understanding is that there needs to be a licensed teacher providing supervision to that class, that pre-K classroom to receive the UPK subsidy. They don't have to be doing the direct instruction right now, but there does need to be supervision. And again, I don't mean to belabor this point, but have heard directly from a childcare in my community that this fall, when they're trying to recruit licensed teachers, they found candidates who were eligible for provisional license, but needed someone to hold that license. And the supervisory union in which the childcare was within didn't want to take on the risk of supporting a provisional license for someone who wasn't in that building. And AOE also didn't feel comfortable taking on that responsibility. And so this issue of, I guess, again, as I read that seems like the license about the individual, the educator, but not the system that supports that educator accessing that license, and want to make sure that we're looking at the whole system that provides the support for someone to access a license if they meet the criteria.
So that's a helpful clarification from Beth. And we can Brett James is gonna come in and talk about this language with us. If we have questions about how licensing works, you don't want us to be making policy decisions based on your kid's care and your license that is not valid anymore. So I appreciate that we'll all bring our personal knowledge into this room. I do it all the time myself. I just want to make sure we're not making decisions solely based on it. So we can have more testimony on this if we need to. And sort of that highlighting of it, it's about sort of system responsibilities as well as individual licensing responsibilities. I think might be helpful for next week. Draft of a sentence. We also our timing is a little squirrely today, so I think it might be helpful if we run through the amendments so we understand them. But maybe not have conversations about them right now, and I can pick this up again tomorrow. Sorry. Team, thank you.
Number 7, page 6, line 3, recommendations. So we're still in subsection C, the duties of the committee. Recommendations for the provision of essential early education services, including recommendations for determining full-time equivalent enrollment and weighted long-term membership of children receiving such services. Any questions before we move on? Okay. Oh, I'm not supposed to invite questions. Sorry. It's like a
Clarifying question.
clarifying, okay. So we're going to jump to section 2A, the pre-kindergarten education model contract. The first thing you all have added here is on line 21, just asking that AOE consult, it's already built in that they would consult with the implementation committee, but adding other relevant stakeholders in developing the model contract. And then on page 8, number 3, this language came to you, and then you all are adding a requirement that the contract include a requirement for the provision of special education services. Brand new language for you all. Section 2B, pre-kindergarten pupil weight report. On or before December 1, 2023, the Agency of Education, in consultation with the Pre-Kindergarten Education Implementation Committee, shall analyze and issue a written report to the General Assembly regarding whether the cost of educating a pre-kindergarten student is the same as educating a kindergarten student in the context of a full school day. The report shall include a detailed analysis, recommendation, and implementation plan for the sufficient weight to apply to pre-kindergarten students for the purposes of determining weighted long-term membership of a school district under 16 VSA 4010, which is the section where all the pupil weights live. The report shall include draft legislative language to support the recommended pre-kindergarten pupil weight and implementation plan.
There's a little more in the section, but just wanna.
Just curious why it's proposed as in relation to the kindergarten context. So it's like we ask to analyze, recommend, and for a weight that's sufficient to apply to kindergarten students. So I guess to me, it seems like that's the point, right? We want to provide something sufficient for pre-K students. Why is that in relationship to kindergarten students?
Part of it is I think it's become clear that kindergarten is, turns out to be slightly squirrely in a way similar to pre-kindergarten, which is, a reason that I think is committee. In terms of just like how many hours is spent and how much money is probably spent by districts in relationship to the weight. And I think there's been, based on some of what's in the RAND report and various other conversations, I think there's also sort of the assumption that needs testing, that the cost of pre-K and the cost of K in a school building are the same. So that's like sort of, rather than starting from scratch and taking 5 years to do this, to just sort of start by testing that assumption and seeing if it works.
To C. Again, brand new language. Agency of Education data collection and sharing. On or before August 1st, 2023, the Agency of Education shall collect and share the following data with the Joint Fiscal Office. Do you want me to read through all of it? I don't know time-wise.
This is all data that Joint Fiscal thinks that they need in order to do this well to help us.
It's very much related to the number of pre-kindergarten children. So it starts with tell us all of the weighted pupils across the state for 2 different fiscal year, or using weights that are in effect now and weights that will be in effect on July 1, 2024. And then a number of pieces of data related to pre-kindergarten children themselves. So the number resources needed to operate a public pre-K system, pre-K children by year of age, total education spending and other funds spent for children attending public pre-K, the same information for tuitioned out students to private providers. If the school district operates a public pre-K program, the number of hours and slots offered in the public pre-K program, the number of students residing in the district enrolled in the public pre-K program, the number of students who are being tuitioned out to a private provider, number of students enrolled in a public pre-kindergarten program who reside outside the district and therefore they're being tuitioned into a public pre-kindergarten program, and what is that associated non-resident student tuition. If the school district does not operate a pre-K program, the number of hours of pre-K provided to each pre-kindergarten child, and the tuition costs for pre-kindergarten children. And then section 3 is an amendment to section 4010, which is where all of the pupil weights live. This would repeal the current pre-kindergarten weight. This will be current on July 1, 2024. By repealing this, it's making the weight calculation the same as grades K through 5, which is we're going to count as 1, and then you multiply it by the following amounts, and then these little asterisks represent all the other weights that could be applied. And this section would not take effect until July 1, 2026. If section 3A is some contingency language. So the amendments to 16 VSA 4010, which is changing that pre-K weight that we just walked through, shall not take effect unless on or before July 1, 2026, the General Assembly enacts legislation establishing the following. A definition for the minimum number of hours that constitute a full school day for pre-K education. A requirement that all school districts shall be required to follow the same minimum number of hour requirements for pre-K education. And a requirement that all school districts shall be required to follow the same contracting requirements for the provision of pre-kindergarten education. So that weight change would not go into effect unless these things happen. And this section would take effect on July 1, 2023.
Scott Catherine.
So if all these three things do happen, then the weight becomes 1.
0, 1, yes.
Right, okay. But the implementation committee is also recommending a weight, right?
The implementation committee is, so AOE is recommending a weight. You've asked for this pupil weighting report
Okay, but the implementation committee,
is,
they're not recommending a weight?
sorry. Let's see. No.
Okay, I just want to make sure there weren't two statutorily authorized. Okay.
No, this is, that change from negative 0.54 to 0/1 is the only weight change in this bill. You do ask for AOE to come back with recommendations.
I wasn't with you all last session when we did all this, or the other stuff around the weights. So forgive me, but can you change one weight without having implications for all the other weights? And I know that like.
Is available to answer that
answer
question
this.
in a moment. Unless you want to answer that question.
I would defer to JFO. I would love to answer that question, but I'm gonna stay in my lane and defer to JFO.
Sorry, I'm just speaking over here. Sorry for interruption.
I don't believe you all made any changes. The only other section in the pre-K section is this education leadership language, which we talked about, I think last Thursday, where the Human Services draft asked for a deputy secretary position. And this just asked to create a senior level position with the purpose of evaluating the status of early ed and special ed within the agency.
Yes, sorry. So I know I sort of touched on this last week, but I feel like it bears repeating that by giving AOE until November 2025 to recommend how to hire somebody appropriate for this role, we're basically leaving the role unattended for 3 years. And I would like to ask respectfully that the committee consider changing the date on that report to 2024, understanding that that might be the best we can do.
The date on the report?
Yeah. So that they are enabled to hire in 2025 versus.
Let us talk to the education committee and find out why they put it as 2025.
I spoke to someone informally today who said that the education committee did not consider that date in their.
Where did that date come from?
I think that came over in the Human Services version. And I was not in that committee. I can't speak to that,
Okay,
but I can find out.
that's fine, consider it. It seems like a long time for a report, given that there's already a report
Hire
about
one
it.
person.
Well, it's not,
I know.
okay, it's like a restructuring more than a hiring. But there's also already been a report about it, so I hear you, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And that's still more than a year away.
Exactly.
Okay, let's do some research with our colleagues on that one.
And that's it for pre-K.
More questions?
Let's hear from Julia first. Or you have more questions for Beth?
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
now, sorry, going back, just getting caught up. Is there a chair of the task force implementation, and is that
That's
AOE?
It is. You look at page 3, line 1. The Secretary of Education and the Secretary of Human Services will serve as co-chairs.
That was it. Sounds good.
Easy one.
Thanks, sorry. Okay. Thank you so much, Beth.
Do you want me to stick around, or are you gonna be talking about pre-K for the rest of
No,
the
we're
time with this?
talk to Julia for just a moment and we'd love for you to stick around for that and then we're gonna talk about S100.
Great.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, for the record, Julia Russell, Joint Fiscal Office. I'm not sure if there's a specific question you'd like me to respond to or something specific you'd like me to talk about.
That question.
Yeah, so trying to reconstruct history, Tammy Colby did a report, made recommendations for all the weights. It did not include a pre-K weight change, and last year when all the other changes were made, just sort of stuck with the pre-K weight that we had. Is that?
Yes, so that's accurate. So Professor Colby and her team looked at weights, and the charge to them specifically excluded looking at the pre-K weight with a misunderstanding or miscommunication with respect to the pre-K weight. So the General Assembly was waiting to get the information back from the RAND report to further understand the pre-K weight. And so we're here now where all of the weights are due to change in fiscal year 25. But there's been no further analysis for the pre-K weight.
And as I read this draft, it sort of asks for information to update the weights and specifically looks in relationship to the kindergarten weight. It does not sort of look at the impact of changing the pre-K weight on sort of the whole system. Does that matter or not? Can you change one weight and the current weights still have their intended impact on taxing capacity? Or if you change one, might have some impact on the value of the other weights?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because the way that all of the weights pre-K aside were calculated was in relationship to each other, right? So Professor Colby looked at the relationship between all of those weights and the associated taxing capacity. As we know, because it's a statewide education fund, all else equal, if one district has an increase in weighted pupils, then they'll see an increase in taxing capacity. But because it's a statewide education fund, there will be other districts that have a decrease in taxing capacity. The relationship between any change to the pre-K weight and other weights will impact taxing capacity of those other weights in the sense that we're adding a new number to the mix. And depending on how that recommendation is formulated, I mean, if AOE is looking at the current construct of the weights that are due to be implemented, it could be they could look at how that pre-K weight could fit into the construct.
So, I mean, given that, makes me wonder whether we should add something to the report that asks to look at how an adjustment to the pre-K weight, what the impact would be on all the other weights.
You reminded me, Julia, the other day about other things we put in statute last year about the other weights being updated. Can you remind me when that's happening?
I will have to check. Act 127 included, which was the pupil weighting bill, included, I believe it was in 2027, but I would need a double check. But a look back to look at the weights and recalculate them It tasked AOE and JFO.
Recalibrate.
Recalibrate, excuse me, not recalculate.
Like people's heads are gonna explode.
There was very specific language that this committee in particular spent a lot of time working through.
I feel so attached.
Forgive me.
No.
Of thinking about what that recalibration would look like. And so it's in a few years due to do that. And then it's I believe every 5 years thereafter. But I could double check that.
And then we're anticipating that we're gonna work on the ELA next. We'll have a report and time to work on the ELA next year. Because that is forthcoming.
Yes.
So many things in here.
And I will.
I again would like to reiterate my desire to add something that says how they all play with each other.
I hear that. I'm concerned that AOE doesn't have the capacity to do that. And that we will never get answers to any of our questions if we make our questions too big.
Just also remembering that we've had challenges with weights in the past and we don't wanna shift one thing and have unintended consequences.
So I did just double check. It's the updates to the weights are on or before January 1st of 2027. And then every 5th year thereafter, updates to the weights to account for cost changes to the underlying weights and so on and so forth. On page 12 of the bill, people are interested in looking at it. The act. Any other questions that I can help the committee with?
Is the data request in the bill sufficient for you to support us on the next steps around pre-K?
Yes, thank you. I think that it, from what we've brainstormed and seeing the language in the bill, I think it captures some of the big picture data questions. I know that some of this data is currently collected by AOE. Other data points, I'm not sure if they're currently being collected. But I think that this is a pretty comprehensive request for data so that we can better estimate the cost of pre-K and understand, what's going on. And if the system were to become whatever system the General Assembly is interested in, we can have better estimates.
Thank you.
Yep.
Sorry, we're like, your attorneys in all directions, time status thing, so do you want to join us for 5 more minutes so we can go deeper on some of the things that people want to go deeper on? Sorry.
I did pull up some information. Where would you like to start?
I sort of shut down conversation because of time, and so I'm opening conversation back up. So where did other people have conversations that they wanted to dive into once the language from Beth? We sort of halfway through, we stopped talking about it and we were misunderstanding it. Should we just start at that halfway point for conversation? Is that helpful for people, or do people have sort of lingering issues that are top of mind, or did Beth not need to come back into the chair because everyone had issues resolved? Yes, Peter.
I had an issue which I followed up on, tangential to Representative Andrews, in the sense that the study and the hiring of a person who will focus on early childhood ed involves both a date issue and a combination of responsibilities. That language said, a senior person who shall be responsible for early childhood ed and special ed. I queried, why would we want that person to have divided attention back when that language first popped up? The answer I received after following several suggestions was AOE, excuse me,
I got very.
insisted, yes, very different. And I guess the education committee did not want to jeopardize a relationship with AOE over that issue. I remain troubled that we are treating this as a central priority, a new initiative, and having a person who will have that as a dual responsibility together with one of the most demanding and challenging areas of education called special.
Brad is coming in tomorrow and maybe someone else can come in from AOE to talk through that. I'm feeling also very curious about how Triple E, which was essentially, special ed for kids, younger kids, and the fact that they're sort of counted as part of school counts and how that the dollars for that fits in with 175 payments, and that's all sort of like something I want to understand better too. And so I'm not sure, the Triple E part is what makes sense to have them administered together by the same person. I don't know. So we can ask.
The shorthand answer I got was, oh, every one of our senior staff has more than one responsibility. Take that for what it is.
Okay, let us dive into that a little. So we do not have time to take testimony on all of the policy issues that the policy committees took testimony on.
Just reporting.
Yes, I know. And so let's do deeper dives with our colleagues on those committees. Anything else on the Beth, what Representative Sims brought up around there's sort of the systems level licensing and how the system supports versus the individual licensing. Do you have ideas on that?
Well, I don't know that I have ideas. Again, for the record, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. This is my, so all of the teacher licensing requirements, that authority to set those requirements is delegated to the Professional Standards Board, and they do that through rulemaking. My limited understanding, and I can brush up, so it's not so limited, should you want to go deeper, but my limited understanding today is that the provisional licensure, it's a license held by the educator, but because it's provisional, there are certain, it's a way to become licensed and teach without meeting without meeting some of the core requirements for a full license, right? Provisional versus, I don't know what else to call it other than the full license. And the way the rule is set up is that part of obtaining that provisional licensure is you have to have an application from a superintendent or some a like person in an independent school who's willing to not vouch for you, but there needs to be so the rule says the Standards Board shall issue a 2-year provisional license with an endorsement to an individual on the application of a superintendent, director, head of an approved school, or entity receiving state appropriated grants for statewide visually impaired, statewide deaf, hard of hearing, or statewide intensive needs special education when the local district or approved independent school is unable to find appropriately licensed and or endorsed applicants after making all reasonable efforts to do so. The application for provisional licensure shall include an explanation of how the applicant will be mentored and supervised during the 3-year period of the provisional license by a professionally licensed Vermont educator. That is one very small piece of a much longer rule. And I just say that to kind of orient you all to that kind of play between system and the educator. So it is a license held by the educator, but there are other pieces that need to be in play in order for that license to be granted. And I think this language is broad enough, and we can craft whatever language you all want, but I think this language is broad enough saying what should the provisional licensure requirements be for a pre-K teacher. I think that would sweep in all of those other mentoring, does there have to be a showing of not being able to fill the position? That's all part of the provisional licensing process by rule now. Is that,
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, my sort of understanding of what you just read is that like the superintendent can grant that provisional license.
no. It's the standards board that grants it.
Can apply as part of that package, and that a childcare center does not have that same path. But I hear you saying that the language in there might be inclusive enough that it can ensure that there is a path for a childcare center who has someone seeking a provisional license to be able to submit applications.
Do you want me to come back with some more specific language related to a mixed delivery system just for
Why don't-
consideration?
Why don't you two talk a little bit and then I'll figure it out for next time we're together, because we need to. Thank you.
Welcome. Any other changes to this, the pre-K section right now?
Let's wait and figure it out.
Okay.
Ellen, hi. Hi. We're so excited to have you here to talk about S100.
Right.
Bye, education people.
Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. So yesterday, House Environment and Energy passed out draft 6.1 of S100. Their amendment is a partial strike all. It only amends the first 25 sections. The rest of the sections were worked on by House General.
And David has taken us through all of them.
Okay. Where do you want me to start?
I would like you to, if you could share your screen.
Okay.
I sent you a Zoom. And if you could show us really quick overview of the bill and then sort of the sections that are related to tax credits and fees.
Okay. I don't know if I have.
Do you happen to know what the vote was out of?
It was 11-0-0, I believe.
Oh, delightful.
So I don't know if there are any tax credits or fees in my sections. So there was language when the bill was first introduced about the wastewater connection permits and removing the A&R wastewater connection permit. And that could have related to fees. However, that section was removed in lieu of sort of a study provision. Then I think the only other part about fees is the Act 250 fee adjustment, which is section 18. Yes, so section 18 of draft 6.1, which while I'm trying to get into this meeting.
You can, it's okay, just take your.
Okay, thank you. So if you're looking at the bill, starts on page 30. All right. Nope. I'm sorry, I am not great at this.
Got it.
Okay. So today, under my name is draft 6.1, as voted out of House E&E. So the first 15 sections relate to municipal zoning, and it makes a number of changes to requirements that municipalities have to abide by when they adopt municipal zoning. And and this is a housing bill, so they are related to housing. So section 1 is about parking and
We're gonna follow along on our own devices. Okay.
okay. Huh, that's interesting. So section 1 is about parking.
Oh, there it is.
Okay. Okay, section 1 is about parking and limiting the number of parking spaces municipalities can require per dwelling unit.
Nothing to do with this.
Section 2 requires that duplexes be allowed in residential districts and that in sewer and water areas, fourplexes be a permitted use. There are some changes to the accessory dwelling unit statute to make sure that it is treated the same way as a single family dwelling. There's also a provision that towns can't discriminate in their zoning against hotels that rent to those using public assistance. There is a mandate about density. So in sewer water areas, 5 units per acre are allowed. And there's also a density bonus for affordable housing to exceed the other density standards. Section 3 requires towns to only review a limited subset of criteria in regard to emergency shelters. And in section 4, emergency shelters are defined as what we know as homeless shelters. So that's the federal definition. Additionally, this section requires that they do not, putting restrictions on daily and seasonal hours of operation can constitute interfering with the intended functional use of an emergency shelter. The definition section adds definitions for accessory dwelling unit, duplex, emergency shelter, as I just mentioned, multi-unit or multi-family dwellings. And then it also allows a town to define the areas that are served by municipal sewer and water infrastructure. And that definition relates to the increased density that the earlier sections require. Section 5 requires a municipality to provide additional information to the Department of Public Service when they update bylaws. This is already a requirement in statute, but it requires them to provide additional data, including GIS data on their zoning districts so that they can be compiled for a statewide database on zoning. Section 6 relates to appeals of decisions related to planning and zoning, and it changes the standing for, currently it's 10 people who are property owners or voters within a municipality are allowed to appeal. This is changing it to a person aggrieved, and a person aggrieved is someone who has a particularized interest in a interest that is protected by the chapter. And this is the same standard for standing that is used in other environmental cases currently. Section 7 and 8 go together and they allow a town to define a major subdivision versus a minor subdivision, and then allowing them to have their zoning administrator approve minor subdivisions. So currently a public hearing is required for any subdivision application. And so by distinguishing between major and minor, minor subdivisions don't need to have a hearing. Section 9 is clarifying existing language on appeals of housing decisions. And so currently under the statute, if a town makes a permit decision that a residential development in one of the designated areas fits within the character of the area, that cannot be appealed. So the language is reframed to make that clear. And it also adds that other elements of the permit can be appealed other than the character of the area. Section 10 creates by right zoning, which requires the municipality to, if a municipality has to follow the standards they have set in their zoning bylaws or in the statute when they're issuing municipal permits, If they deviate from that standard, they need to have a justification in the permit decision, and they can't, and that justification can't discriminate against housing. Section 11 asks the regional planning commissions to add additional detail to the housing elements of the regional plan. So it asks them to review the statewide housing needs assessment and provide an assessment of the total housing needs for their region, including the price, quality, and unit type or zoning district that may be needed for their region. A similar provision is then added to the municipal planning section so that the town adds additional detail to their housing element, including what public and private actions may be needed to address the housing needs of the town. Section 13 makes a change to the bylaw adoption process. Currently, there's this provision that allows rural towns to opt for adoption of bylaws by Australian ballot. So it removes that distinction. Towns generally under the statute have the ability to use Australian ballot. And so it's defaulting to get rid of the distinction between urban and rural towns. Section 14, Section 14 is related to the Municipal and Regional Planning Fund. So this language perhaps is of interest. So of the disbursement to municipalities under the Municipal and Regional Planning Fund, this is adding a provision that allows up to 20% of the total to be dispersed to the Department of Housing and Community Development to administer a program to provide direct technical consulting assistance under retainer on a rolling basis to any municipality to meet the requirements for a designated neighborhood development area. And so they currently already do this, but this is specifying that a certain percentage can go to assisting towns in achieving the neighborhood development area designation. It also moves.
Say that one more time.
So the department already provides assistance to any town that wants to apply for a designation, but this is allowing specifically that up to 20% of the municipal delegation under the municipal disbursement, the Municipal and Regional Planning Fund, 20% of that can go to a specific technical assistance for the neighborhood development area designation. So they have apparently right now a wait list of towns that want help getting the designation. And so this is providing some specific funding for that.
Okay. I asked because there's sort of like, there are tax credits attached to neighborhood development areas. So if that worked as a way of increasing the number of neighborhood development areas, that could have a fiscal impact on the state in a very long chain of events kind of way. That's the only reason I'm asking.
Yeah, and so this fund generally is funded by the money from the property transfer tax. And so there is a dedicated funding source for this specific program.
I don't mean the technical assistance,
no, right.
Tax credits related to the technical assistance.
Right, so I don't think the neighborhood, that we added the neighborhood development areas last year. Right.
But we limited it.
Yes, so it's limited in the statute.
It's very much like a peripheral long-term
Yes.
impact, not a, yes.
Yes. So then, section 15 asks the regional planning commissions through their umbrella agency VAPTA to look at their future land use maps and how they can be made more consistent. And then to report back on how this went. This is added as part of their current duties that they've already been funded for. So there's no additional funding for that in this one. Section 15A is an appropriation to hire housing resource navigators at the regional planning commissions through VAPTA. So it's $300,000 for that. And then section 16 starts with the Act 250 sections. There is a temporary provision that raises the housing jurisdictional trigger from 10 units to 25 units if located in one of the designated areas that are listed. And then it also adds a provision so that the construction of 4 units or fewer within an existing structure only counts as 1 unit towards that total. Additionally, the cap on the number of priority housing projects that can be exempt from Act 250 is also temporarily waived, so that within the downtown neighborhood development area or growth center, it's unlimited number of priority housing projects that can be exempt. Section 16A adds the requirement that anyone trying to qualify for either of those exemptions apply for a jurisdictional opinion that assesses that they do qualify for the exemption. Section 17 allows towns with a downtown or neighborhood development area to apply for a master plan permit under Act 250. Currently, growth centers can already apply for this permit, but it's extending it to downtowns and neighborhood development areas as well. And then Section 18, which is at the bottom of page 30, adds this language about the Act 250 fees. And so starting on page 31, it adds a couple of small phrases throughout this section. And so for applications for projects involving construction, the fee is $6.65 per $1,000. So it's adding this phrase for applicants for projects. And this is somewhat related to the language further down here, which states that currently it says, in no event shall a permit application fee exceed $165,000. This language has existed for a long time. However, the Natural Resources Board is reframing it so that it will read, in addition, in no event shall the fee for an individual permit or permit amendment application, including each individual permit or permit amendment application seeking approval for any portion of a project involving a master plan, exceed $165,000. So it's clarifying that no individual permit or permit amendment application shall exceed $165,000.
Do you know where that number comes from?
No, I think it's been in the statute for quite a while. So it's not changing. So $165,000 has been in the statute for quite a while. And so it's not changing that number. It is just clarifying that it applies to an application as opposed to an entire project.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so especially with like phase development, like with a master plan where you may have 10 applications for permit amendments over the life of the project, it's trying to clarify that $165,000 doesn't apply to just the site, but each individual application.
I was just going to note, it looks like the letter number system got a little funky there with the elimination of 6. I don't know. Maybe you see it differently, but I'm just saying it might need to be cleaned up. Because it goes from 5 to B.
Yeah, so it starts with A.
Oh, got it.
List within A.
Thank you.
And so there's no conjunction in this list because it's a hybrid list. I did check with the editors. So eliminating 6.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The other fun part about this section is that there's a really long-standing typo on page 31 that we're getting to fix because it currently says Agency of National Resources.
Congratulations.
I know. It's been in the statute, I think, since before I started. So it was on the list to be fixed, but we're fixing it here, so. Yes. So any other questions on this section? Section 18A is a report asking the regional planning commissions to look at creating a framework for municipal delegation of Act 250 permits and report back to that at the end of this year. And then there's another report. So there's the Act 250 report that was added in last year's legislation. They're adding a new element to it to look at specifically the housing jurisdictional trigger because there's a temporary provision in this bill. And so to evaluate if it should be made permanent. Section 19A changes the due date for the designated area report. That's also currently underway from July of this year to December of this year. Section 20 looks at changing topics entirely, looks at deed restrictions and covenants, and so prohibits private deed restrictions and covenants related to minimum dwelling unit size on a property or requiring additional parking. And so that has the same language that's in the municipal parking section as well. Section 21 requires that anyone selling property located on a class 4 highway or a legal trail disclose that the property is located on one of those and that the town is not required to maintain them. Sections 22 and 23 relate to another study. And so this is a summer study about energy code compliance and how to increase compliance and potentially delegate enforcement of the code compliance to the Division of Fire Safety. Section 24 creates the Rural Recovery Coordination Council, which is another reporting requirement. And so it sets up a council to look at elements related to structural changes and improving coordination across all levels of government to support rural community development. All right, section 25, almost done. So section 25, as I mentioned before, originally as S100 was introduced, it had a section that would have exempted projects from the A&R wastewater connection permit. This language changes that, so it is a study, sort of. It asks the A&R to review their current requirements and reduce and make recommendations to reduce duplication between the A&R connection permit and the municipal connection permits.
I love that.
So, yes.
So it might result in a reduction in fees if we implement recommendations.
Right, and so this doesn't actually make any statutory changes. It just asks the A&R to report back on that.
Just trying to make this, exciting for everyone, bring ways me into it. Thanks for bringing that with me.
And that's it, and then there's effective dates.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
Ellen, I may have missed it, but I didn't notice you mentioning anything in the creation of the distinction between a major and minor review at the local level. Whether this act disturbs any of the in-place notice requirements for the neighborhoods or neighbors or adjacent land to an application.
No, it doesn't make any changes to the notice requirements. It does. One of the primary change in that section related to subdivisions is that currently all subdivisions require a public hearing, and so it's now giving towns the options to designate certain subdivisions as minor, so that they don't need to have a hearing on it.
So, if I understand it, if the town elects to delegate that to their zoning administrator, the town could or needn't preserve the notice requirements to neighbors near the subdivision. Could go either way, I guess.
Yes, I think so. One of the distinctions is that I think that still the adjacent landowners will receive notice, but without a public hearing, there won't be general public notice.
Okay,
Yeah, but it's left up to the town to how they want to define that.
thanks.
Anyone else? Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we had a full walkthrough from David of the other sections. I have an email from him confirming that nothing has changed, as Ellen said, since he last hung out with us and took us through it. If folks need another walkthrough on that section, it's been a little while. You can also read, but sometimes it's hard to remember that. Okay, we still need to hear from JFO on the fiscal notes. So we're gonna do that right after the floor. And if the floor goes past 4:30, we won't come back, we'll do it tomorrow. But ideally we'll do it today, and then would love to send this bill on this journey.
This way.
Something doesn't get uncovered with our fiscal note. So maybe see you later, maybe see you tomorrow, who knows? We are scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. if I don't see you again. And remember, Source will send you a text message, so look at your telephone